From the Ear to There Travel Studio, this is the Ear to There Disney Podcast.
The Ear to There Podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Ear to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ear to There Disney Podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. On this show, I take a different Disney word and then give you some history, some background information, some stories, myths, legends, jokes, whatever it is about that word. So we're going to get right into it. This week's Word of the Week is brought to you by the letter C. C for Carolwood. Now, if you're not familiar with that word or why it's really, really important in the history of the Disney company and in the life of Walt Disney, then you're in for a treat, because this is a fun episode. This was a fun one to research. So Carolwood Drive was where Walt and his family had a house built in the Holmby Hills section of Los Angeles back in 1949. Now, the reason he picked this lot on Carolwood Drive to build his house was because it was a really big one. It was a big lot, and it had a lot of room for him to build his own backyard railroad, which, of course, he named the Carolwood Pacific Railroad after the name of the street where his house was built. All right, so in order to really understand the significance of and the importance of the Carolwood Pacific, we're going to take a trip back in time. That's our back in time sound effect. All right. So Walt's interest and fascination with trains went all the way back to the time when he was a little kid. His dad, Elias Disney, actually worked as part of a track installation crew for the Union Pacific Railroad, and his dad's cousin was a locomotive driver for the Santa Fe Railway. Now, this cousin used to stop by the Disney farm in Marceline, Missouri. This was sometimes when his train would be traveling through, and he would spend nights at the Disney farm telling Walt all about his life driving the trains. It was really during his years in Marceline that Walt got super into locomotives and trains. In an October 1965 issue of Railroad magazine, Walt actually wrote an article about his life and his love of the railroad. I wasn't going to read it, but I couldn't find a recording of it anywhere. And I am actually going to read it because I think it's important to hear in Walt's words, even though it unfortunately will be my voice, just how deeply his fascination and his love of trains went and goes. Because really his fascination with trains was one of the inspirations for Disneyland. So here we go. These are Walt's words, not mine. And I'm not going to do a Walt impression because it would be terrible. So in that article, Walt says, "I suppose I've always been in love with trains. As a small boy living on a farm near Marceline, Missouri, I had a unique claim to fame. My uncle Mike was an engineer on the Santa Fe's accommodation train that ran between Marceline and Fort Madison. That was something to brag about to my schoolmates at a time when railroads loomed large in the scheme of things and steam engines were formidable and exciting. We fellows would marvel at the tall stacked engines that pulled into and out of the depot opposite the park where we played, huffing with steam and trailing nebulous smoke plumes. One day in about 1909, when I was 8 or 9 years old and full of nerve, my buddies dared me to climb into the cab of one of them that stood there temporarily deserted and pull the whistle cord. I did so, but as soon as the whistle shrieked, I quickly climbed down in a panic and ran like the Dickens." This is me again. This is Phil again right now. Anytime someone says like the Dickens, always great. Just my opinion. Okay. Jumping ahead in the article, Walt says, "In 1916, when I was 15, my father sold the newspaper route, and that summer, I looked around for some way to earn money until high school reopened in the fall. My brother, Roy, who had been employed by the Fred Harvey system as a news butcher on Santa Fe trains, selling magazines, peanuts, candy, apples, soft drinks, cigars, and so on, suggested that I apply for a similar job. I did so and was hired for 2 months. I felt very important wearing a neat blue serge uniform with brass buttons, a peaked cap, and a shiny badge in my lapel. As the train rolled into one station after another, I stood beside the conductor on the car steps to enjoy the envious states of youngsters waiting on the platforms. I liked especially the MP run between Kansas City and down Kansas. It took 6 hours because we'd stop at every station en route, and we often pushed boxcars out of the way to clear the track. During the journey, I sometimes went to the baggage car and supplied the baggage man with cigars or chewing tobacco, and then I'd climb over the tender and into the engine cab to do the same thing for the engineer and fireman. They let me ride in the cab with them for a while, and what a thrill that was. And the article goes on, and I may quote him a little bit later in the show, but you can see just how much Walt loved the trains as a young guy. So it wasn't until Walt Disney was 46 years old that he bought his first ever Lionel train set. I'm sure you remember Lionel from maybe when you were a kid, or if you're not old enough, maybe your grandparents or your parents had one running around a Christmas tree. For me, my grandparents had one, and I remember going to their house and playing with the Lionel train set. I loved it. And the Lionel Company made really cool, authentic miniature trains that worked just like the big real things. So Walt loved that, but then he learned that some of his own employees, Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Ward Kimball, had bigger trains in their backyards. And Walt decided, hey, I'm the boss. They're not having bigger, cooler trains than me. I mean, these guys, Ollie Johnston and Ward Kimball, they had rideable trains in their backyards. So this is when Walt decided he was going to buy a vacant lot in Holmby Hills on Carolwood Drive. It was a 5-acre lot. It had a big level shelf of land back behind the property that Walt named Yensid Valley. Of course, Yensid is Disney backwards and was also the name of the sorcerer in the movie Fantasia. So he bought this land to build a new home, but what he really bought the land for was to build this miniature railroad. If you look at a layout of how big the house was next to how big the railroad was huge. Like I said, 80 meters of track, which translates to about 2,615 feet. Now, the railroad had 11 switches, gradients, overpasses, a trestle, and an elevated dirt berm. You've probably heard the term berm when talking about Disneyland. Of course, this inspired the berm around Disneyland to keep the people who were inside the fantasy world of Disneyland from seeing the outside world. So Walt's wife, Lillian Disney, she was going along with this plan. I mean, she knew how much it meant to Walt to build this railroad, and probably to top his friends as well. But there was this big area on the property where she wanted to build a flower bed, a nice, huge flower garden to impress her friends and her relatives and to have something really pretty back in the yard. Well, Walt actually wanted his train to run right through that area where she had planned and wanted the flower bed to be. When I say flower bed, I probably actually should say flower garden. It was a lot bigger than a little bed. So as a compromise, Walt Disney built an S-curve tunnel beneath the spot where the flower garden was going to be planted. He actually had an attorney from the studio come out, and this attorney wrote a legal contract that both Walt and Lillian signed in the presence of their daughters, allowing Walt to build the tunnel under the flower garden. Now, one of my favorite stories about the Carolwood Pacific Railroad is about the tunnel itself. Walt, even in 1949, 5 years before Disneyland opened, he was always worried and concerned about story and the experience of his guests. At this point, it was only the experience of the guests in his home, but he needed to plus it. He needed to make it better. So what Walt proposed to the engineers who were building the tunnel was that he wanted an S-shaped curve, an S-shaped tunnel under the flower garden. What would happen was riders would enter the tunnel and they wouldn't immediately be able to see the exit. As they went deeper and deeper into the tunnel, they would be plunged into total darkness. The foreman for the project came to Walt one day and said, Walt, it would be a lot cheaper if we made that tunnel straight. Walt, who was known to have a bit of a short temper, got a little angry and he snapped at him, It's cheaper not to do it at all. I love that story because it goes to show you, listen, he's the boss. Do what he says. He's Walt Disney. All right. So the engineer, the foreman, the team did build the tunnel exactly the way Walt drew it up. So the Carolwood Pacific was pulled along by a 1/8 scale locomotive called the Lily Bell, which Walt named as, I guess, a way to appease Lillian a little further for ruining the ground underneath her flower garden. It was built by a team in the Walt Disney Studio led by Roger Broggie. Now, with help from Roger Broggie, Walt actually built several parts of the Lily Bell, including its smokestack and its headlamp. Most of the machine parts were done by Broggie's machine shop team on the studio lot, but the wooden cab was actually built entirely by Walt himself. Now, the Lily Bell had its first test run on the Disney studio lot on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1949. And this was at a Christmas party for the Disney studio employees. The first time that Walt ran the Lily Bell on the Carolwood Pacific Railroad was on May 7th, 1950. So just about 5 months later. The Carolwood Pacific Railroad's train cars consisted of 6 cast metal wood grain pattern gondolas that were made by the studio's machine shop as well. There were also 2 boxcars, 2 stock cars, a flat car, and a caboose that was made of wood in the studio's prop shop. Now, except for the frame of the caboose, the rest of it was built entirely by Walt by hand. Walt had a fascination with miniatures as well, and the level of detail on the inside of the caboose was pretty amazing. There was a calendar hanging on the wall, a broom, and a working potbelly stove. Now, the Carolwood Pacific's caboose was kept in a barn on the Disney property on Carolwood Drive. And this barn was actually built as a replica on a set piece from the 1949 Disney film So Dear to My Heart. This was modeled after the barn on the family farms property in Marceline, Missouri when Walt was a kid. Walt spent a ton of time in that barn at night after his long days of work at the studio. And there was also a traffic control board for the train inside the barn where Walt could control the switches of the railroad while spending his time in the barn itself. Now, for a few years, Walt would have people over, friends, relatives, celebrities. They would have parties and he would show off the train. Lots of times he would drive the train himself and he would have adults and children riding in the cars behind him. Now, unfortunately, after a while, in 1953, a visitor drove the Lily Bell too fast going along a curve, and that caused the Lily Bell, the entire train, to derail. It fell on its side, broke its whistle, and released a jet of steam across the ground. A 5-year-old little girl who was at the home at the time ran through the steam and ended up getting burns to her legs. Only minor burns, but because of this, Walt worried that there would be more injuries from guests and friends. So he closed down the Carolwood Pacific Railroad and stored the locomotive in his studio's machine shop. Eventually, Disney removed the Carolwood Pacific Railroad's track in 1964. But the Carolwood Pacific Railroad and its operation inspired Walt to have the idea of building a full-scale train in Disneyland Park when it was being built in 1954. Actually, one of the early concepts of Disneyland had the actual Carolwood Pacific Railroad being reinstalled on Disneyland property where guests could ride it and go through miniature scenes from the Disney animated movies. Well, that didn't happen, but you do know that the Casey Jr. circus train, along with the Storybook Land canal boats, took that inspiration, and those 2 attractions are still in Disneyland to this day. Now, Walt loved railroads so much that it was decided that, like the train that surrounded Disneyland, a train would be built to surround each and every Disneyland-style park that was built by the Disney company. So whatever happened to the Carolwood Pacific and whatever happened to the railroad, well, in 1965, Walt donated 1,500 feet of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad track, as well as the trestle from the railroad, to the Los Angeles Live Steamers, which is a group of miniature steam train enthusiasts. In 1968, after Walt passed away, Lillian Disney donated the rest of the track to the Los Angeles Live Steamers as well. Now, after Lillian died in 1997, the Disney residence on Carolwood Drive was put up for sale. It was bought by an investor in 1998, but the original house needed to be demolished due to issues with lead paint, lead piping, asbestos, and a weak foundation. Now, as far as I know, the tunnel that Walt had built under the flower bed, or under the flower garden, wasn't destroyed and was still there and used for storage at least until 2013 when the home was sold once again. And then in 1999, Walt's Carolwood barn, the barn that he used to work on the caboose and run the trains, that was relocated to the Los Angeles Live Steamers Railroad Museum in Griffith Park in Los Angeles. You can actually go and see it. And in 1999, Walt's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, she was actually the one who was at the ceremony to rededicate the barn. So you can still go and walk through that original barn that Walt Disney built and experience a little bit of the history of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad. Now, as for the Lily Bell itself and some of the railroad cars and the caboose that Walt built by hand, since 2009, they have been on display at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. Now, if you don't get out to San Francisco much, you can also find 2 original pieces of Carolwood Pacific rolling stock on display inside the Carolwood Pacific Railroad Room in the Boulder Ridge Villas at Disney's Wilderness Lodge in Walt Disney World. So there, on your next trip to Walt Disney World, go to Boulder Ridge, go check out a piece of Disney history and a piece of history that Walt Disney worked on with his own bare hands. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of the Walt Disney World Word of the Week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You are awesome. I really appreciate it. Like always, I really hope you enjoyed it. This was a fun one. I actually have a tiny little piece of the Carolwood Pacific track in my office. It sits on one of my shelves. It's one of my favorite Disney pieces of memorabilia. I remember being crazy in awe of Bob Gurr's house because he has this big, 2-foot section of the track that he got somehow. Maybe Walt gave it to him. I don't know where he got it, but I remember holding it in my hands and being like, holy cow, this is amazing. Anyway, what a cool piece of Disney history and a cool piece of Walt Disney that is. Hey, if you enjoyed the episode, do me a favor, tell someone about it. I'm sure you have a friend who might be interested in the history of trains and Walt and his backyard railroad. Let them know about the episode. I'd really appreciate it. Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Ear to There podcast next week. So until next time, have yourself an awesome week. Thank you so much again for listening. Stay safe. Enjoy the week with your friends, with your family. Bye-bye.
Ear to there, ear to